So today we're turning to Mary Wollstonecraft, and if we need to take a little bit of Thursday also on her work, that'll be fine as well. But where I would like to start, actually, so the book that you are reading from, excerpts from, or a couple of chapters from, is called A Defense of the Rights of Women, written in the later part of the 18th century. So around the time of the French Revolution, 30, 40 years after Rousseau, 75 years or so after John Locke. And it's on a familiar topic in one sense. It's philosophical reasoning about human rights, about the rights of human beings, except how do Locke and Hobbes refer to the rights of human beings? Whose rights are they? The rights of man, exactly. So it's always gendered. And that's not just a pronoun. I guess man is not a pronoun. Anyway, it's a, what is the word man? Is that called a noun, I guess? It's a gendered noun, general noun. And sometimes people want to say, well, man is really just human. But actually, it seems kind of obvious that the history of political philosophy, whether it's Plato and Socrates and Aristotle, or the medieval philosophers, or the modern philosophers that we've been reading, when they're speaking of the rights of man, it's pretty clear they are talking about gendered men. It's men who had political rights and whose characteristics and whose nature they're describing and referring to. And so Wollstonecraft's essay is a really important breakthrough or novelty in the history of political philosophy. She's not the first person to talk about the rights of women or the status of women or the unequal status of women, but she is one of the most important and most penetrating political philosophy voices of this period, you know, of the early modern period, 18th century thinking. So where I wanted to start was to do something I'm doing in my class also in Ann Arbor, which is to just solicit some comments about the reading in no particular order, but just your own reactions to some of what you read out of Wollstonecraft. An observation that you might have done. By the way, what's up here is a document I'm very happy to share with you, but it's the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on Wollstonecraft. And by the way, if you don't know about the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, it's a hugely valuable resource, free. Just Google Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And then from that website, you can Google just about any topic that we have talked about in this class. I refer to it frequently in, in preparing, for this class and for other classes. And it's very high quality. It's said to be an encyclopedia, but sometimes we think of encyclopedias as being kind of superficial, just the highlights. But the Stanford Encyclopedia articles are written by real experts in the field. They're accurate, they're reliable, they're sometimes challenging. They're really great sources to use, and so I recommend them to you. I have a PDF of this article if anybody is interested in. I mean, you can get it online. You can't get the PDF for free online. You need to be a friend of the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, but I'm a friend, so I get PDFs of whatever. You become a friend by paying $10 a year. So friendship is cheap. I wonder if I'm sure there is an essay on friendship actually in the Stanford Encyclopedia. There's an essay on the philosophy of history in the Stanford Encyclopedia written by me, and which was updated about 2 years ago to include some of the thinking about evil in history that you then read the next kind of version of in the manuscript that you read of mine. But there's a lot of really interesting material in this. I think it's about a 20-page article on Wollstonecraft. Many interesting parts of her life and biography, but one which I wanted to mention in particular is that she had a daughter, also named Mary. Anybody know what's striking about the daughter? Is this something you might have run across at some point? Her daughter married Shelley, the poet, and her daughter was the author of Frankenstein. Isn't that interesting? What a curious crossing of literature and philosophy and centuries. I think of Frankenstein as being a 19th century creation, kind of science fiction creation. It's just so interesting that the daughter of this fairly tormented, kind of tragic figure, Mary Wollstonecraft, that her daughter then married a very famous poet. And then for some period of time, I think Frankenstein was attributed to Shelley, but it was actually Mary who was the author, and now it is correctly attributed to her. So let me ask you all just a few observations, one or more thoughts that you got out of reading the material. Yes. What was that stuff?
I thought it was interesting in the first chapter, she kind of tackled a little bit of the problem of people. Kind of, especially, I guess she especially targeted Rousseau, but just kind of saying that, I guess, the two bullet points she had was God has made all things right, but then evil was also introduced by the future who God made. It was a conversation we talked about a lot last semester, kind of problem of evil and how can God be perfect, or how can he make perfect beings, where the perfect beings are inherently evil in the eyes of a lot of people. So I just think it's interesting that she kind of starts off with that, because I think it's an important part of almost every argument going forward.
Great. So that's a really interesting place to start. The question is coming up with regard to the war in Ukraine. Is this an instance of evil? And the position that I take is that it absolutely is. It's evil in the way the Holocaust or the Holodomor or the Gulag was evil. It is an imposition of massive suffering. And historically, that was often considered to be a theological question. Do you think that Wollstonecraft is thinking of it theologically, or is she thinking of it morally? How did you interpret her comment?
I guess I would say a little bit more theologically, especially at the beginning, because she's saying like they contradict each other. It just doesn't make sense, I guess, theologically. I guess maybe a little later in the passage, she kind of goes in more of like the moral parts and kind of like specifically like a woman's and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. So what's kind of confusing actually about Locke, Hobbes, not so much about Rousseau, but the discourse in the 18th century in political philosophy, there often is reference to God. God did this, and God did that. And so you might think it's primarily a religious argument, but actually I think that's not correct. What is it we say when you're tipping the hat to someone of power? Is there a term for that? It's a tip of the hat to the powerful, to refer to God in these kind of passages. But the interest that Locke has or Wollstonecraft has, I think, is not about theology. It's not about what would God do. Isn't that a bumper sticker? What would Jesus do? They're not trying to offer, I don't believe they're trying to offer a theological argument. Instead, they're trying to give an argument within moral theory or within political philosophy. I think we actually can link that all the way back to that manuscript of mine that you read right at the beginning. How can a civilization which had the Enlightenment rationality of Rousseau, Locke, Kant, Mozart, etc., how can that orderly, rational, moral, justice-oriented tradition have also given forth to the Holocaust, to the Holodomor, to the atrocities of Stalinism, to the Gulag? That's a kind of a contradiction, whether you think of it in theological terms. That was the old-fashioned way of thinking about it. The kind of medieval question was, how could God permit such horrible things? The great earthquake of Lisbon was in, I don't know, at home, I live by myself, so I just shout out, Alexa, when was the great earthquake of Lisbon? And Alexa tells me, or my Google Assistant tells me. I can't do that in class. I could shout out to you. Just quickly Google, but it was something like, I don't know, 1600, let's say. And thousands of people were killed, and Candide, Voltaire in the novel Candide, which you may have read. Has anybody read Candide? Voltaire is a contemporary of Rousseau, but the Great Earthquake is considered to be a problem akin to the problem of evil, because horrible things happen to perfectly innocent people. And how could God permit that horrible event to occur to people who had no blame? They were not, they were not being punished for something. They were just innocent people who were killed and crushed and starved as a result of a terrible calamity. Well, you could pose that as a theological question. How could God permit that? I don't think that Locke or Wollstonecraft actually are that interested in the theological question. I think they're interested in the moral question. And the moral question is, what do we do with the problem of evil within our conception of morality? Anyway, that's a great place for us to start. Other observations that you took out of the readings that you did. Yeah.
I thought it was like kind of like preliminary psychology kind of thing, because like
Good.
they very like have discussed like the self-fulfilling prophecy and the way that like women were being educated, and that kind of led to like men observing the way they're educated and being like, oh, it's natural that they came about in such like a submissive way, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And then she also goes into like the difference between like a friendship between like men and women when they're lovers, and like a passionate love, and you can really get like friendship when one side is so much like more privileged than the other.
Mm-hmm. They're privileged and raised and developed and cultivated to care about certain kinds of things. So you're absolutely right to put your finger on education and formation of girls. And the first significant piece of writing that Mary Wollstonecraft did was a treatise called On the Education of Girls. Isn't that an interesting topic for a budding young philosopher to choose, on the education of girls? Why would she choose that topic? Well, Mitch has kind of given a suggestion why that is, because what's the connection between the education that a young English, let's say middle-class girl is given in 1750 and the situation of adult women in 1780, 30 years later? What is the connection? Anybody want to speculate about the connection? If girls are kind of reared on certain texts and certain ideas and certain pieces of writing about how you should behave and how you shouldn't behave, how does that then get reflected? That's really the point you were just making, Mitch. So maybe you want to take that ball up and roll it around again. What is the connection between education of girls and the situation of women in society, which consists, essentially 50-50 of males and females, of men and women, in conditions of great political and civil equality, by the way? No, not at all. Yeah. Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
I mean, I think that we obviously know that women really have the capacity intellectually to function in a way that they're able to benefit themselves, but if they're not, like, they're literally not given the opportunity to do that, when they're pegged in this box, and without education, I mean, as smart as someone may be or as capable as someone may be, if they don't have the means to kind of become the kind of like a person who like is just talking about become like a man, then there's no way that they're able to do that at the start of their education, because if they're not, if there's no means to learn these things, then there's absolutely no way for them for that gap between men and women to close, because they're not provided so much.
Excellent. So there's the question, what kind of human being does a young female person become as a result of this culturation. Education is really culturation. It's taking on social roles. A little parenthesis. Is there an analogy with class behavior or racial behavior in the 18th century or in 21st century? If you are a working class boy, do you learn a certain way of becoming a man, which is different from what a middle class or upper class boy learns? Well, I'm kind of suggesting to you, yes, not necessarily through formal education, though the tracking which used to occur in American high schools, I don't know if it was true in your high schools anymore, but there was kind of, when I was in high school in industrial Peoria, there was a technical track for people who were, not bound for college, not bound for glory. Bruce Springsteen, the great philosopher of the 20th century, technical track. And then there was the advanced track or the college track. And that was a much smaller group of people who were bound for college. And that was very class oriented. So what Wollstonecraft is referring to here, I don't want to go away from the male-female question. I just want to point out that that culturation into division is something that we're familiar with in multiple ways. And I think we could talk also about racial tracking, racial behavior, what we learn as a young white man, a young black man, a young white woman, a young black woman, about how to behave in public and with other people and with your friends, with people who are not your friends. All of that is socialization. And some of it is kind of a formal part of an educational process, and others is more, just hanging out and whatever, the ways that we learn our manners, the ways of behaving in the world. That's what she's interested in about females. Is she happy? Anyway, I didn't mean to go on. I want to hear what various people have to say. Yeah.
I feel like the questions at the beginning also kind of represent how she feels that women are treated in society, and is trying to obviously point out it doesn't seem right if we're all the humans that are supposed to be this above the animals and stuff, because she says so that man by struggling with his passions might achieve the degree of knowledge that the lower animals can't have. Even just taking out the man part, putting in just humans and that, it's essentially saying women aren't given the option to struggle with their passions and gain the knowledge that would increase them above animals. So she's, I guess, technically implying that men treat women like animals, or don't let them leave the animal kingdom essentially and rise above it, and they're stuck there and can't get out, which is probably, I guess, one of the worst offenses that maybe a man could understand in that is being trapped in the animal world.
Right. And does that actually sound familiar to you from your 301 experience? Did you talk at all about how the Greeks thought about, how Aristotle in particular thought about men and women? Aristotle actually has some very explicit things to say about man's rationality and female passion, emotionality, clearly a differentiation, but a subordination. Men are capable of rational thought, rational self-control, and women are driven by their emotions. They are, exactly as you say, they're closer to the animal kingdoms than they are to full humanity. That's kind of explicit in Aristotle. I don't know that it's explicit in Locke, but it's implicit. And it's definitely implicit in the modes of education which she is being critical of. Okay, more round robin, other observations. Education, we're going to come back to that because that's really right at the heart. Who else has an observation you'd like to make about what you were struck by that is kind of different from what Locke or Hobbes or Rousseau had to say? Yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
I think that the way to start is actually similar, at least to the foundational way that Aristotle argues in the United States and the I can't say words, sorry. But yeah, I think that in those two books, he I think her way of arguing here is similar in that we want to see like the function of humans is our sort of rational faculties, and so we undermine ourselves when we try to act in ways that go against them or contradict them. And that's the basis for a lot of her.
So I would agree with you that her style of reasoning is philosophical and kind of generalizing. But I would say that she's also got a basis of criticism already, which is that whether it's Aristotle or Locke, the assumption is that it is the male gender who have these characteristics. And by implication, female people don't have these characteristics. That's what she's challenging, actually. She's saying to Rousseau, for example, in her critique of Emile, the kind of biographical novel that he wrote, and I've forgotten the name of the woman, a girl who's featured in Emile, but she talks about her quite a bit. The representation of females is, this kind of, I was going to say negative. Possibly Rousseau would say, no, I'm not negative about females. They're just different. And this is how they're different. They're not rational, or they're not fully capable of self-control or whatever. That's what she's taking issue with. She's saying that we need to understand, as you say, we need to understand humanity is capable of rationality. She absolutely embraces that point. What she rejects is the idea that that's gender specific, that male people are capable of rational thought and rational self-control. Instead, her most basic advocacy is men and women, given the chance, have equal capacity for rationality, for deliberation, and for rational self-control. But that's where we come back to education. What is it that men and women are disfigured by in education? We haven't mentioned the other line of her critique, and that is that men are also disfigured by their I don't know, disfigured is kind of a nasty word, I guess, but they're contorted, they're distorted, they're led to bad outcomes because they're given bad value guidance by suggesting that wealth, ostentation, fancy clothes. Where is that picture of Diogenes when I meet it? Remember the Greek living in the barrel? He rejected all that stuff. She believes that 18th century English society has been corrupted by the idea that what life is really about is consumption of stuff. It's luxury goods. If you can be lucky enough to get some wealth through whatever means, and then have a nice coach and boots with gold buckles and whatnot. I don't know what counted as fancy clothes. I'm not sure my Keens would count as fancy clothes in the 18th century, probably be diminished as a working man, more suitable to living in a barrel, I suppose. So she thinks actually that the way in which young men are cultivated is different from how young girls are cultivated, but it's also diminishing of their human capacity, their human nature. So she thinks actually that education doesn't serve either men or women very well, but it has the most deleterious effects on women because it pushes them furthest away from this ideal of developing their intellectual capacities, their capacity to self-regulate. She's a very strong believer in the idea that there are the passions and emotions. Men and women have them, and that a part of rationality is rational self-control. And girls are, well, I want to talk about the education that she is most negative about, so I'm not going to anticipate that. Any other observations or things which kind of came to your mind as being really important? Is there anything missing in this vindication of the rights of women? We didn't read the whole book, but if this were written in the 21st century, are there a few paragraphs that would be in the book that it's a little bit surprising that we don't find here? there doesn't seem to be at any point so think about the really, I don't know, the powerful rhetoricians of the 18th century. Give me liberty or give me death. The bold statements of the importance of liberty, the importance, death to tyranny, the importance of individual rights and so forth. Really strong declarations about what you believe in. We don't actually seem to find that. Or maybe you found it and I didn't find it. I invite that as a response. But I don't find a strong statement, 2 sentences that say, Rousseau or Locke, you've made a terrible philosophical error because women are entirely the equal of men. I don't find a simple statement of that. It's implied, but I don't find the statement. I don't find that affirmation that John Paine, Henry Paine, Michael Paine, Thomas Paine, Eric Paine, no, Thomas Paine. That Thomas Paine bold female emancipation statement. Did I miss it though? Did some of you find a strong statement about female emancipation? It is about female emancipation, but there isn't that strong and heroic statement about it.
Yeah, I think, I didn't find it, at least from what I can remember, I can find it, but I think it's part of her strategy, argumentatively anyway. Because I forgot where, but she talks about how, assuming that after she talks about education, how education affects how people the rational faculties and stuff. She says well, even if let's even if we don't start here and assume that women are the same as men, you haven't really given women the chance to even prove that yet. So so you're still unjustified regardless. So really, really what should be done is to give women that chance to do it. And then of course it's implied that women do have that equality capacity.
Good. And what's really striking in reading the book, it's almost like a performative demonstration. This book is absolutely the equal of John Locke's second treatise in terms of, brainy, brilliant, logical argumentation. She was accused of having a masculine manner. We could deconstruct that a little bit also. Is she too masculine? Is she taking on the features of men in her logical, self-controlled, carefully, logically developed series of arguments against Locke and against Burke, the critic of the French Revolution. So gender voice is a part, I mean, she doesn't ever use that term, but it is, I think it's one of the things that we can kind of observe. I saw a hand, whose hand was just, yeah, good.
Maybe some of it might be a little bit like her tone too. I was just looking at this passage where she's like, blacks husbands as well as their wives are often only overgrown children in these days to early debauchery. They are hardly grown men in their outward form. We don't need a messenger angel from heaven to tell us what happens when the blind lead the blind. It's sarcastic and kind of not I guess it's a little bit satirical, I guess. And before in that section, she talked about how women were just supposed to be quiet, or society said they were supposed to be quiet and not heard kind of theme, I guess. And this, she kind of, I guess I could see why they thought this sounded like a man speaking, because she's not afraid to kind of.
So she speaks up. She's not silenced by.
And also, she meant for it to be funny, not just straightforward and she meant for it to kind of stir the pot on purpose, which I think kind of right piece of the rock.
Okay, so but you put your finger on a really important point, that she believes that essentially all English people, men and women, of a certain class segment. She was not an affluent person. And I want to talk about her biography a little bit shortly. But she wasn't talking about poor Londoners. She wasn't talking about dock workers. She wasn't talking about field hands. She was talking about people with enough education. They were literate people, both men and women. They could read. They could have conversations about poetry. They had a kind of mental sophistication. That's kind of the level of development that she's interested in developing. And then at that level, what is the Masterpiece Theater? It went on for years. It was the upstairs, downstairs kind of thing. Downton Abbey, was that what it was called? And some of you have seen some of those episodes. And are you struck by the superficiality of the goals that both the men and the women appear to have? The things they care about?
Well, that's why I can't stand, what's that? Pride and Prejudice.
Mm-hmm.
I hate the book, I hate the movie, I can't stand anyone in that book.
Because it's so superficial. Okay, that's really, really interesting. I think some 19th century female novels actually are bitingly critical of that superficiality.
Yeah, that might be what they were trying to get you to see.
But that's totally interesting, because that's very much part of her critique, whether it's sarcasm or it's just kind of the laying out. Men in British society, English society, are also driven by the wrong objectives. They're driven by these kind of material wealth and ostentation objectives, and they're competing for being the best looking, having the highest honors, becoming a lord, the kind of visible. But those are not valid human goals, in her opinion. And so there's a problem with male creation, male education as well. Yeah, go ahead.
Something that I find interesting that the two female authors that we've read in the honors program seem to be more sarcastic and have, I guess, more personal, like, I don't know, like tales almost than like some of the male authors that we read. And
That's
obviously it's
interesting.
not a great comparison because it's like 2 versus like 12. But I find it interesting that they choose to write like that, because one of the their complaints is that women are seen as too emotional, yet they write with so much emotion and or not even just passion emotion, but like sarcasm and jokes sometimes. So I'm kind of I wonder why they chose to include that, because I feel like that could be a way to attack if you were someone who's looking to be see she uses jokes, she uses sarcasm, she's
It's interesting.
so emotional, she's lashing out or whatever.
Who is the other person you're thinking of?
I don't remember her name at all.
So
I'm not
I've
sure.
read a lot of Karl Marx, including his unpublished writings, and he lashes out in a way that makes Mary Wollstonecraft look like a piker. He refers to other authors as writing a whole bunch of horse piss. He uses the word horse piss. We wouldn't use that in an academic article today, but it was actually in letters. But he was stridently sarcastic and ironic. And Proudhon, the socialist philosopher, wrote a book called The Poverty of Philosophy. And he had the most nasty, negative things to say about Proudhon. So I wouldn't say that it's, it's only, I don't know, Wollstonecraft's voice, which is sarcastic, and Marx is just so well known for being a strident polemicist, making cruel fun of the people like Bakunin. He couldn't stand Bakunin. Most people couldn't stand Marx. He was apparently a very hard person to hang around with. But anyway, it's interesting. It's an interesting observation. If you think of who the other person was, I'd be curious. I find her writing actually fairly cool. I don't find it passionate. I find it cool in just the way that Locke's argue. It's almost like geometry.
Yeah, I think overall she's very
Mhm.
just moves from thing to thing and isn't really putting in so much personal opinion. I do agree overall with that. But I just don't remember like Rousseau, like I don't remember seeing any sarcasm in
Mhm.
Rousseau, like not even a little bit. And
Uh-huh.
maybe it's just because I don't get like his sarcasm or
It's
whatever.
really interesting. Did you make that point?
Gourmet. She was one we read last semester.
And I don't think I know her. What is the book? I just remembered the sarcastic remark that Marx made about Proudhon. He wrote in public, the philosophers think he is a great economist. The economists think he is a great philosopher. I am both, and he is neither. That's pretty nasty, don't you think? If it were in a tenure review, it would definitely be a very negative comment.
I think we read The Equality of Men and Women,
Uh-huh.
and then she has another work on the ladies' grievance.
And is that from the,
Yeah.
is that from the 16th century, 17th,
17th century.
17th, yeah, 1600s, so I'm thinking, yeah. Okay, that's cool. I mean, that's a really interesting observation, and it's also kind of a sad observation about the program, because really, it's not such a great thing that we're in a situation where you can name the two female authors that over a four-course sequence you would have read who were female. Any other observations? I want to talk a little bit about her biography, and I want to talk a little bit about her conception of what she thinks the way that girls are trained and are portrayed in stories and in manuals of manners and so forth, that we really need to pick apart, because that's really at the heart of her critique. But her biography, I think, also is very interesting. But any other observations that are on your mind before we move on to? So let's talk about her biography a little bit. It's really interesting to me that she does not embody the characteristics that she says English society foists these ridiculous ideas on girls. It's not that she's not right about it, it's that she escaped those ridiculous ideas in some way. And maybe I'll go back to some of the biographical statements from the Stanford Encyclopedia article. What is kind of interesting, well, number one, she had very little formal education. And I think we saw with Hobbes also. Remember, Hobbes had almost no formal education, but then he had an uncle who had a little bit of a library and a little bit of money, and was able finally to send him to Oxford. And so Hobbes didn't come from wealth, but had an opportunity to read a great deal of literature, and eventually his real intellectual opportunity came from becoming the tutor and companion to a young diplomat type person, and traveled a lot, and there was a big library. So Hobbes's intellectual biography, think again of Diogenes in the barrel. Can you picture a big bookshelf at the back of that barrel? Do you remember the picture I'm thinking of? Yeah. So it was just a cask. There are no books in there. So Diogenes didn't have a lot of access to learning. And most people, if they don't have a lot of access to learning, do not become philosophers. They're not stimulated, they're not kind of challenged to develop their capacities in the way which allows them to become great philosophers. Most English people did not become great philosophers. Hobbes did, Locke did, and it's interesting to ask the biographical question, what coincidences, what accidents in their histories allowed them to gain intellectual engagement? Well, over the years at UM Dearborn, I've seen a number of you and your fellow classmates who have what I think is real intellectual aspiration. Whether your high school gave it to you or not, you are kind of reaching out and saying, I want to learn more, I want to read more, I want to question more. I kind of think of Hobbes and Locke and Mary Wollstonecraft in that category. Her background was she was literate, so she could read if she could get access to books. She was very familiar with the Bible, but she was also very familiar with the writings of Shakespeare and other great instances of British literature. She had a few learned friends as a young woman. She formed friendships with a few learned men who encouraged her and also made resources available to her. And eventually she became affiliated with kind of a journal, and she did a ton of writing for this journal. She did book reviews, she did translations, she did short articles. So a lot of her writing happened through this journal, but that gave her actually the stimulation. Anybody feel like you've learned a lot by writing a short essay? I hope so. I certainly feel that way about you and about me. But she did a ton of writing for this journal and also had access to books. How would you feel about having your education completely in your own hands? What you have access to is, let's say, the library, Mardigian library. It's a pretty decent library, but that's all you've got. You don't have professors. You have a few curious friends of your own generation, a few older people, maybe a pastor in your church or an imam or a more senior person that you have respect for. And that's it. Your education, your formation is in your hands. How do you feel about that? How much progress do you think you will make? Will you become Hobbes or Locke or Wollstonecraft?
I think it depends on, what books you have and just
Mhm,
how passionate you are, or if you find your passion in time where you lose gas
mhm,
to do that yourself. Because I've recently gotten really into also like self-educating through like science books, because I really
Mhm.
like science. So I bought a lot of like evolution books
Mhm.
and genetic study books, and I'm trying to read them and just like understand more about my own subject. And I feel like you do learn a lot
Mhm.
reading from them. However, I guess the question is, do you have the right access to them? Do you have access to the right books? Or like I said, like, do you find your passion in time to actually start doing that and getting really into it? Or are you just gonna kind of like fizzle out after you realize
Right.
you don't like any of the writings or?
So those are
any of the
really good
subjects?
points, because you're affirming that self-education, being self-taught, is very possible. Each of us can be self-taught about a subject or about a number of subjects, and we can do it in a way which leads us deeply into the subject. But then secondly, it takes a motivation. It takes some sense of excitement, something I really want to understand what Darwin was referring to. Or I really want to understand what Kant meant by the categorical imperative. And why he was so stupidly wrong. That can be a source of inspiration. Nietzsche was fascinated by the history of philosophy before him because he thought there were such idiots. They were so wrong about civilization and morality and humanity. And he wanted to defeat them and to show that they were completely wrong. So having a passionate engagement leads some people to a lot of intellectual development. She seems to be one of those people. I guess that's what I'm coming around to. She read a great deal. She thought about some of the very same books that we've been reading. In fact, all of them. She read Hobbes, she read Locke, and she read Rousseau. And as you know, she had a lot of comments both about Locke and also about Rousseau. She was critical of both of them. But she also learned a way of thinking, which was really closer to Locke than to Rousseau. Rousseau writes in which I would call kind of a romantic way, a lot of metaphors, and he's kind of elliptical, and he doesn't have this kind of logical, I shall first demonstrate X, and then I will demonstrate Y, and then finally Z, and it's off to the printer. He's more imaginative in his writing. And she is more of a, I don't know, it seems to me, more of a a logical thinker. She wants to break the problem apart into parts and then to reason her way through, kind of in the way that Locke reasons about the state of nature. So that development of her intellect, her development as an intellectual person, as a political theorist, was quite unusual, quite, you might say unexpected, given the lack of opportunity that she had. She didn't go to college and university and become excited by her great tutor at Oxford. Rather, she educated herself, she read, she engaged in polemics, she associated herself with some other important writers, and then offered her own views and opinions. That's a really fascinating series of events. So you might say she's just a pure intellectual. But I'd like to refer you to another part of her experience. 1785, let's see, she was born, when was she born? 1759. So when she was 26 years old, I'm reading it right down here, 1785, she set off on a trip to Lisbon, where her friend Fanny, close friend, who had married that February, was expecting her first child. On board the ship, Mary met a man suffering from consumption. She nursed him for a fortnight, the length of the journey. This is a little mysterious in her biography. I mean, I find it mysterious here. I haven't read more of her biography, though the author of this has written a very major biography of Wollstonecraft. So this woman is the author of this article, is a real expert on Wollstonecraft. This experience is related in her first novel, Mary, a Fiction. She gained an unfavorable opinion of Portuguese life and society, which seemed ruled by irrationality and superstition. At the age of 26, she's against superstition. She's in favor of rational accounting of the problems of life. And it was a sad experience because her friend Fanny and the baby both died. So she got to Portugal, got to Lisbon. I think it was Lisbon, the very same city that I was mentioning before about the earthquake in whatever, 1690 or whatever. She had to have a career. And she didn't have the option of inherited wealth, which allowed her to live as a lady. She wasn't following the advice of the How to Be a Successful Girl books, The Dummy's Guide to Being a Successful English Girl. What is rule number one in that education that she hated? Rule number one for a girl, an English girl, of the, let's say, middle to upper class. What is the route to economic security of that?
A lot of it's just to look pretty for men, and I think that, I don't know if that's the most important one, or if it's the first
Yes.
rule, but it was all about appearance.
Exactly. So look pretty, be physically appealing to men, and get a husband. Ideally, a lord of some sort, a lofty husband with a good deal of money. Downton Abbey. Everybody's looking for a husband, and looking for a living. And a living means wealth, which can then support you in the style to which you become accustomed. She flunked that test because she was not aiming her life at finding the husband who would make her life secure for her. She wasn't pursuing that girl's agenda. Now, I don't know whether she also, she doesn't say anything at all. Did she, for example, like a ribbon in her hair? I don't know if that's what makes an English girl attractive. But from what she writes about the admonition to English girls, you must be attractive, you must be agreeable to men, you must be coquettish, you must draw the men to you like bees to the flower, bees to the honey. I forget what it is bees like to come to, flowers, I guess. That your goal, that's the central point of the education of the female that she is so clearly and correctly negative about. Why so? Well, A, it's completely superficial. It doesn't say anything about the real value of the young woman. But secondly, it's subordinating her other capacities. It's basically saying looking good is the main thing in life, and therefore cultivating your mind, being a rational person, being a virtuous person, virtue in the sense of conducting your actions in accordance with your own assumptions about good and good treatment of other people and so forth. Those would be goals that she would be happy to pursue, but those are not the goals which are recommended by the manual. The manual is all about being cute, being appealing, don't be offensive, don't say sarcastic things to your elders because they won't like you and you won't get invited to the right luncheons and so forth. So she didn't pursue that agenda, but she did have relationships, and I mean romantic and sexual relationships. She didn't live very long either. I think she was about 55 or so when she died, which is quite sad. But here's maybe the last piece of biography I wanted to mention. She traveled to France in 1792. Remember, the revolution in France was 1789, but the terror and the tumult in France was continuing to take place into the 1790s. So traveling to France was a big deal, especially for an English person, because France and England were in a hostile state, and eventually they went to war, and the Napoleonic Wars between Britain and France and other countries became a very important part of the story. But she traveled to France, and she met an American businessman named Gilbert Imlay. Now, this is also kind of an interesting part of her story. So he was also a minor writer. He was traveling to France. In order to protect herself from persecution by the French, it's like us going to Russia today. I'm not positive I would want to go to Russia today, because I'm not positive that we would be treated well. Traveling as an English person to France, she was subject to the possibility even of violence. So she, with Imlay's encouragement, she passed herself off as the wife of Imlay, and she had a child with Imlay. So obviously she had sex with Imlay. In other words, she had a romantic sexual relationship with this American businessman who broke her heart. Is that also a surprising part of the story? Anybody else surprised at that? We've been talking about a very rational, orderly, logical, reason controls the emotions person. But actually, in this particular episode of her life, she had a crushing emotional experience. So with Imlay, here's the way the author puts it. They never married. Imlay was the source of Wollstonecraft's greatest unhappiness, first through his lack of ardor, then because of his infidelity, finally because of his complete rejection of her. Most of all, her love of Imlay brought Wollstonecraft to the realization that the passions are not so easily brought to heel by reason. That's an interesting statement by the biographer, because it's kind of anti-Aristotelian. Remember, the Aristotelian model of rationality is the emotions exist, but reason is their master, and the rational man is in control of his emotions at all times. She kind of embraces that idea, that rational self-control is also the right model for a woman. And this author, anyway, says what she finds actually in her own tumultuous life experience is that emotions are not, minor things that are easily mastered and controlled. You might say that, well, you could interpret that in several different ways. You could say she's not living up to her own ideal. You might say that. Or you might say, she has just discovered something really important about the human condition, that Aristotelian hierarchy of reason over emotion is actually not a very good description of human reality and experience for either men or women. That reason and emotion are kind of intertwined. I'm thinking of the fact that I don't think you read a piece by her, but Martha Nussbaum. Do you remember that name? It's in my manuscript a number of times. But she's the woman who wrote the essay about compassion and Philoctetes, the abandonment of this sick guy on the island suffering, and his Greek mates coming back and saying, well, we're so sorry you're suffering, we feel compassion for you. Anyway, she writes a very long, great essay. She's a marvelous philosopher. She should be number 3 for the program. We should have some great writings of Martha Nussbaum. But the interesting thing about Martha Nussbaum is she writes a lot about the emotions, and she writes a lot about the full human life. She's very influenced. She was a classicist. She's roughly my age, a little bit older than me. I knew her at Harvard when she was a junior faculty person. And so she was trained in the classics, trained in moral philosophy, and super, super smart. She has visited here. I invited her to come here and give a talk 10, 15 years ago. I had a funny experience with that invitation. She teaches at University of Chicago Law School. And so I called her up and said, I'd like to have you come and give a talk. I can even provide a small stipend and it'd be just great. She said, well, I'd be very happy to. I'd love to meet your students. She just published a book on liberal education and had visited many campuses. She wanted to visit you up here, boy. And she said, but I don't fly. I hate planes. And therefore, you'll have to arrange for a limo to get me from University of Chicago to here. So we did that and all went well. I think the observation I'm about to make is, you might, I don't know, let me know if you feel it's an inappropriate observation. Martha Nussbaum is not a person who wants to subordinate her looks and her self-presentation as an attractive woman, while at the same time being one of the brainiest, most rational, logical, and critical philosophers who are doing their work today. In other words, she rejects the dichotomy between sexuality, being attractive on the one hand, and being rational, philosophical, rigorous, and strong. She combines those things in a way which I find very appealing. Now, reality check here. Was that a sexist thing to say, do you think? Anybody feel like I just said something kind of sexist about Martha Nussbaum? I hope not. I have huge respect for her, but anyway, I hope you didn't feel that way. Yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think that's really important, I think, to experience, especially, I guess, for a female writer, because a lot of females nowadays are told that, you know, in order to be a career woman, they can't have families or like feminine, like they have to be this like masculine version of themselves in order to succeed in the world.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to hear that her life was like, she kind of was a typical woman in a way, you know, she got married, or I don't know, she met somebody, had a child with them, you know, like even if it didn't end right, you know, I would hope that she wanted the children or the child and loved them. And, you know, motherhood is a very emotional like time. So it's really cool to see that she is embracing the balance, because I think the balance is really important to people, and you don't have to be like this robot and negate absolutely every single emotional part of
Yeah,
you
that's a
in
very good
order
point.
to be like respected or this
Yeah,
higher up person, because a lot of the times like women's power comes from their emotions and their ability to understand people, and you know, not that men don't have this, but you know, and that's why a lot of them make really great parents, because they're really emotionally attuned to their child and stuff, and it's why a lot of the typical roles have happened, but I think it's really important, like in modern days, and to kind of project that, to realize like you can still be like a mother and like love a man and have a child with them and still be this logical thinking, like higher up, or I don't know if it's higher up, but like just
Kind of an elite intellectual, which might have been thought to be a masculine track. And also, but it seems to turn out, I don't know if you noticed the next sentence. She broke with Imlay a year or so after having a child, Fanny. And in April, let's see, right before that, she twice attempted suicide in May and October of 1795. That's a tragic thing to read, isn't it? Because it's after the birth of the child, and it's in the midst of this very unhappy relationship with Imlay. So it's kind of emotional reality cracking through in a way which is, not at all the orderly axiomatic presentation of a kind of a series of thoughts. But I kind of like, I forget which of you said it, that about Martha Nussbaum. I mean, I said a number of things about Martha Nussbaum, but the fact that it's important to combine these different parts of life experience into one life. She did combine them, not completely successfully, though it goes on to say that she did ultimately marry a man named William Godwin, who was a very famous and today well-known political commentator in the late 18th century. And they had the daughter, Mary, who became the author of Frankenstein. It would be kind of interesting. I don't know whether anyone has written about this. And I've never read Frankenstein. I just know how he moved. He wasn't very graceful, Frankenstein. Too bad we don't have that on the Zoom recording. But it would be kind of interesting, don't you think? It's a little bit suggestive that the daughter wrote a book about this monster in a family history which had a lot of fracture in it, a lot of difficulty and fracture. I don't know if that is relevant to the composition of the book or not, but I would be curious if anyone has ever written about the relationship between the author of Frankenstein and her own mother's importance as a feminist. I don't think the term feminist was used, but a women's rights and emancipation oriented author who also had a very tumultuous emotional life with these couple of men. So I wanted to talk about the biography a little bit in order to kind of make a point with you. And the point is that I guess in the program, we tend to think of the authors we read as being sort of desiccated museum samples. So we go to the cabinet, we take out Hobbes, or we go to a different cabinet, there's Kant, there's Mary Wollstonecraft, full-formed, bunch of thoughts, and maybe an AI bot prepared to say, and the categorical imperative maintains that X, Y, and Z. We think of them as kind of disembodied and de-historicized. But actually, what I'm kind of suggesting to you is that maybe we actually can't even understand Hobbes without thinking about his development as a rude young man whose father, do you remember his father had to run out of town because he beat up the other pastor in town? So that's kind of that's a traumatic experience for a boy. He traveled quite a bit in Europe. He met Galileo, believe that or not. That's insane. Two figures in the honors program met each other in Florence. Does that like boggle your mind? I was boggled when I learned that. So I think the point I'm kind of getting at is that placing these figures into their own itineraries, their own growth and development process, I think we get, what do we get? We get a different kind of understanding maybe of their work, but we also get a different kind of understanding of what it is to be a human being, how to make that transition from the boy frightened in the farmyard by the fact that his burly pastor blacksmith father has just beaten up the pastor of the local church and is on the run, to the state of nature where people are in fear of beatings and death. Is there a connection? I don't know actually if there was a connection, but it seems kind of connected. It gives you a richer approach, I think. I'm trying to write a blog post on Isaiah Berlin, who is a philosopher, Jewish philosopher who emigrated to, I think he was Russian Jewish philosopher. He's a brilliant philosopher. I doubt you've read his work, but he's definitely worth reading. And one of the things which I admire about him is he tries to place philosophical ideas into their historical and biographical setting. So he wants to understand how people like Alexander Herzen, the Russian thinker of the mid-19th century, how his liberalism and anarchism and anti-tyranny points of view got expressed through his childhood and his young adulthood and into his writings. To me, that's actually, a lot of philosophers think that's irrelevant. We should stick with the museum and just pull Hobbes out and get his chatbot going when we want to debate Hobbes. But what I'm kind of proposing to you is that it actually makes sense to try to put I don't know, maybe it's just so obvious that you all think, I'm not sure why he's going on about this, but I can tell you that in teaching philosophy, maybe not so much in the honors program, maybe that you get more historical context in your other courses in the honors program, but in teaching the history of philosophy, we rarely talk about the biographies of the figures whose writings we're talking about. The only thing I know about Kant, after having been hired as a Kant specialist in one of my first jobs, is that he, as regularly as clockwork, took a walk through the city of Königsberg, which is now called Kaliningrad, and it's in Russia. It was then part of Prussia, I guess. He crossed all the bridges, and the ladies of Königsberg would set their timepieces by the fact that he's now on the third bridge. That's the only thing I know about it. And yet I know an awful lot about his philosophical systems and ideas and theories. And what I'm kind of proposing to you is that that's actually kind of a superficial, or at least a very one-sided understanding of the person. And I think just reading Wollstonecraft's book without knowing anything about her biography is maybe also somewhat one-sided. It's not paying attention to her own struggles as a human being in a world which was very gender stratified, where she wound up as being non-gender typical. I don't mean she presented in a non-gendered way. She may have been a very attractive, woman philosopher, but she intellectually presented herself in a way which broke those conceptions of femininity. And that's really, really interesting to me, that her life experience kind of embodied also what she wrote in her books. So we've only gotten halfway through, and therefore, I guess what I'm going to do is ask, I don't know whether I should even ask you to read I was going to finish this piece of the course by asking you to read a number of blog posts on the future of liberal democracy, but I'm not ready to go to that yet. So I think we'll have another day on Wollstonecraft, especially since we've only had 2 female writers in the whole experience in the program. We should at least have 2 days on Wollstonecraft. So we'll have further discussion about Wollstonecraft on Thursday. Excellent. Thank you.